Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. My name is Jared Wilk, and I am your 2024 president of the Greater Boston Association of Realtors. With me is our esteemed legal counsel, Bill Mullen, head of risk management.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you, Bill. There's been a lot of dramatic changes in the real estate industry recently between NAR lawsuits, class action, antitrust violations. You've got changes in commissions, MLS. Bill, there's a lot that people are trying to take in. Can you help us get through?
Let me try to give you a short overview along the timeline. Department of Justice approached NAR initially, and they had some issues with buyer agency and how the industry was practicing. In particular, buyer brokers saying that our services are free to the consumer, and that, as we all know, is just not true. Jared, I will interchange the term broker or buyer agent somewhat. I'm speaking of the same person. However, Department of Justice targeted, let's say, NAR, and they reached a settlement with NAR. And it had 3 or 4 points dealing with buyer agency, which I'm not going to go into. And when it was about to go into effect, the Department of Justice came back again and said, we're going to investigate you more. And NAR said, wait a minute, you investigated us, we came up to a settlement, this should be done. And that turned into a lawsuit because the Department of Justice said no. At the trial level, the NAR lost, and then they took it up in appeal and won. Then Department of Justice took it up in appeal and lost, and now they're trying to get it into the Supreme Court. And so that's the DOJ issue. Now let's go into the second issue, was a class action lawsuit that was started in Missouri, and NAR defended that to the best of their ability, and the allegation was NAR's policy in MLS that you must fill out an amount, even if it's $1, must fill an amount to be paid by the seller to the buyer broker. And that turned out to be an antitrust violation. And there was a $1.7 billion recovery. Now, clearly, NAR didn't want to pay $1.7 billion, so they entered into settlement talks, which they were having all along, even during the litigation, and came up with an NAR settlement, which we're faced with today, and I'm going to go over today. Additionally, not to make this more confusing, but it is, our MLS PIN in Massachusetts is not a realtor board owned and operated MLS PIN. So what does that mean? They decided that they weren't going to follow the NAR policy, which I'm going to go over in a minute, which one of the things was you cannot offer out compensation MLS at all. From a seller, from a listing agent, anywhere. Cannot be discussed, nor can you have a link to another website that offers compensation. That was part of the settlement. MLS PIN in Massachusetts decided not to go along with that. And so they're going to allow you to make offers of compensation from sellers to buyer brokers. And we'll get into that in a little bit.
All right, so it's a lot of changes and a lot of confusion, I know, amongst a lot of realtors I've spoken with. What is GBAR doing about these changes?
So let me talk about the rule changes first. Basically, the NAR settlement has 3 things we need to focus on. Number one, it releases any company that did less than $2 billion of transaction, I believe in 2023, from liability in the future. So if you follow along with the NAR settlement requirements, you won't have liability as we go forward. You can't be sued, in other words. Now, the second one was that you have to have written buyer contracts with your buyer clients, buyer broker and buyer contracts. They have to now be written, which, as you know, Jed, I've been advocating for 15, 20 years. But now it's an NAR rule, not a state law rule, but an NAR rule in order to be a realtor and use MLS. And then the third one was offers of compensation could not be made in MLS at all. Zero, zip, or nada, as I said already. However, our MLS PIN is taking a little bit of a change on that. We'll get into more detail about that later.
Well, I have a question. You just said, Bill, that you made an emphasis, there's a difference between a NAR rule and a state rule or a law. Can you clarify that?
Sure. NAR is making it as a requirement of membership that you must do certain things, and one of them is a written buyer contract. State law doesn't require a written buyer contract. However, you have to establish what you're authorized to be paid. And one of the problems the Department of Justice has had with us for years is we don't have a written contract with the buyer, and therefore we don't establish what you're entitled to. And I get lots of questions from saying, well, the listing agent's offering out more money. Can I take it? The answer is no. You've established a payment with the buyer for your buyer broker services, and you can't exceed that payment, even if listing agents are offering out more. And again, not state law, but required under NAR settlement to protect you from liability, and it is the best practice. I can't emphasize that enough. It's been 20 years in the making. We as an industry have to start using buyer representation contracts, period.
Bill, can you talk about the MLS PIN specific changes?
Oh, good. Let me go over those specifically with our audience. So the slide you see before you now says MLS PIN rule changes. Let's talk about the first one. Offers of compensation, if any, will be made by the seller, listing brokers, and cooperating brokers will no longer split commissions. Second one is listing agreements must disclose that the seller is neither required to offer compensation nor required to accede to any cooperating broker's request for compensation. The listing broker must disclose this to the seller before seller signs the listing agreement. And this will be part of our new exclusive right to sell and agency agreement listing agreements. Let's go up to the next slide, which shows if a seller elects to offer compensation, the listing agreement must also say that the cooperating broker will be an intended third-party beneficiary of the agreement with the right to ensure the same. The reason for that is if the seller was to decide that they weren't going to pay you at the closing, the buyer's broker would be able to sue the seller in order to enforce it. And the last one is, before posting a listing, the listing broker must certify in a checkbox designed for this purpose in Pinergy that the listing broker has notified the seller of the seller's rights not to offer compensation and not to accede to a cooperating broker's request for compensation. So again, these are the MLS changes, and all of these changes have been built into our exclusive listing agreements with consented, designated, and dual, or whichever one you use, or the agreement for agency with designated and so forth, whichever one forms you use, these changes are all built in.
All right, so Bill, to clarify, if someone still wants to offer buyer broker compensation through MLS PIN, can they and how do they?
Actually, it's a good question because they can. However, if you decide as a brokerage to offer out compensation through MLS PIN, they've redesigned the site already, and there's little check boxes on how you do it. And you want to offer out compensation from the seller to the buyer broker, you can do that. However, what that means is you will not be covered under the NAR settlement as to liability. So if you do that in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it doesn't go along with the NAR settlement, and therefore you could still be liable, be sued again. So NAR settlement covers your liability to not lose again. You could still be sued again, but you'd have a defense of we're covered under the NAR settlement. So how do you do it is the question. That's a great question. You take the listing agreement, which we prepared, that conforms with the NAR settlement, and they all do, no matter which one you used, which gives you, as the seller's agent broker, authority to offer out money and MLS PIN. And so that's how you'd set up the paperwork in order to do that.
Okay. And will this be up to each individual realtor, or is it up to the broker?
Brokers. You have to talk to your broker owner and what the policy is for your brokerage. It's imperative, because if your broker owner wants to follow the NAR settlement rules, not to have liability, you cannot offer out money in MLS PIN. Okay. However, if the broker owner is okay with it, then you can. So you need to check with your broker owner first. Excellent question.
Okay, Bill, what about the buyer representation agreement? What changes are being made to that?
Excellent question. There are several mandatory changes required under the NAR settlement. The slide before you shows the mandatory provisions. You have to specifically disclose the amount of compensation for the buyer's representation agreement. In other words, you have to agree what you're going to be paid for by the buyer, what you're authorized to be paid for. Compensation must not be open-ended. So you can't say this X amount of that and Y amount of this. In other words, you can't say X amount, but if the listing agent through their seller offers out X plus 2, you can't take it. You can only be paid what you agree to with your client. Compensation must not exceed the amount with the buyer, as I just said, and compensation amounts are not set by law and are fully negotiable, and you need to explain that to the consumer. It's what you as the buyer broker is going to be paid. Now, if the seller does offer out concessions or buyer broker amounts, it's applied against what you're going to be paid. And if they're both X, then you're fully paid. If it's X minus 1, then the buyer would have to pay you 1% more, or however you detail the transaction with the buyer.
All right, so what about the timeline for NAR, for the GBAR forms? When will those be available?
So let me just talk about the forms first. We hope to have our forms out prior to August 17th. They've already been prepared by General Counsel. And we're hoping they'll be out in the next couple of weeks, but they're with the vendors right now to put them up, and we work with several different vendors. Before you see the NAR settlement timeline. You could see this all dated back several months. The Department of Justice class action suit started prior to that. There was a trial, and in March 15th of this year, NAR entered into a settlement with the lawsuit regarding antitrust and class action lawsuit. Settlement was reached on April 19th. Preliminary approval was given by the court. The timeline to go into effect is August 17th. So that's the real date here. And again, Jared, we're hoping to have the forms out. We need to have them out prior to that date.
Yes.
I just don't have a specific date right now. Subsequently, in September, there's the deadline for realtors MLSs, whether or not they're going to opt in or not opt in on September 16th. And as we know, MLS PIN has decided not to opt in. And the last thing, November 26th, stay of the settlement. A settlement hearing is going to happen on November 26th. There's also a lawsuit here in Massachusetts. And MLS PIN has reached a settlement with their plaintiffs, but it hasn't been approved. And the court has pushed it back till after the NAR settlement is approved or not on November 26th. And then we'll determine whether or not MLS PIN and the plaintiff's settlement that they're proposing will become final or not.
Thank you all for joining and watching and taking part of this conversation. Be on the lookout for more communication from GBAR, emails, a postcard, the webinar. You're going to have Legal Live Zoom on August 13th at 1 p.m., where Bill will be on hand to take questions direct from members.
As you know, the Legal Lives are very popular. You, on the computer, press a little hand raise. You come to the front screen, and I take your question directly. We don't have you type it in and do any of that type of stuff. And that's at 1 o'clock on the
August 13th.
August 13th.
Thanks for joining us on another GBAR conversation. Have a good day.